Hey guys, Mr. Davis here. This is going to be the last part of Chapter 5. What we're going to be looking at is something called ecological succession. And what ecological succession is all about is how you go from a barren landscape to a thriving community of organisms. So let's take a look and see how nature builds a community. So, ecological succession is studied as a way that we look at ecosystems because they're constantly changing. It's a gradual process of change and replacement in the types of species in a community. So you may start out with just some grasses and then maybe some shrubs, and eventually they'll grow to bigger and bigger trees. And you can see this if you're looking at a forest that's just recently been planted. So you may start out with some low-lying things, and trees start out as, seeds. They start small and they have to get bigger. Well, it's not just those trees that are growing, but the organisms that are going to live in there, because larger trees can support maybe more species of birds and all kinds of things like that. So what you get is a constant change of the entire ecosystem. As a new ecosystem arises, as a new community arises, though, it oftentimes will, though, push out some of the other species. So let's take a look at how this happens. So here's the thing. You can start out with something that's just barren land. And this is a picture from one of the calderas, so one of the insides of one of the volcanoes at Volcano National Park in Hawaii. Now, this is one of the inactive calderas, so there's not active eruptions there or anything along those lines. And if you take a look at that, you see that white stripe there? Well, that's actually a road, sort of. It's a path that has been laid down for driving vehicles through. This is a pretty big, just empty area. It looks like the surface of the moon. But literally, less than 100 yards away, where there hasn't been a lava flow for probably 1,000 years, it looks like this. You have this lush forest. And this is literally a tropical rainforest. So how do you go from that dead, empty, barren landscape that looks like another planet, like somewhere you would test a rover before sending it to Mars, which they do, to this lush, beautiful, vibrant tropical forest that was literally used for making movies like Jurassic Park because it looks like a prehistoric wilderness? So how do you do that? Well, it all starts with a process called primary succession. And what I've got right next to me here are a couple of different species that aid in this primary succession. So let's take a look at that. Primary succession is the type of succession that happens when you have no ecosystem that started out beforehand. It begins in an area that previously did not support any life. Like, for example, new islands created by volcanic eruptions, or areas exposed with a glacier retreat, or any other surface that has not previously supported life. This is because there's no soil. All right, so all you have are bare rocks. And if you look over here, what you can see are two types of plants that can live on bare rocks. The farthest picture over, that's something called lichen. And lichen is a weird symbiotic life form that is both fungus and plant. It's actually a plant that has fungus that live inside of it and extend their little hyphae down. And lichen is especially interesting because they can grow in dry places, and they exude, or they put out, chemicals that can actually dissolve rock and extract nutrients directly from them. A lot of times this is things like phosphorus, if you remember the phosphorus cycle from my last video. It might be some nitrogen compounds, or maybe even some sulfur compounds, and several other things that are necessary for life, which is why lichens grow well on volcanic rocks. Another kind, which is the picture immediately next to me, those are mosses. Now, mosses are another type of plant that can grow on barren rock, but they require a little bit more water. They photosynthesize a bit, and they can absorb carbon directly from the atmosphere and build their tissues up from that. And they can grow in the tiniest of crevices as a result. Sometimes they'll both grow on similar surfaces, and they'll kind of compete with one another. But a pioneer species is any species that can grow in an uninhabited area that starts an ecological cycle where other species may become established. So previously, what I just showed you, the previous two pictures, those were lichens and mosses. Those were pioneer species. But in some cases, this can be grasses as well. Once the pioneer species have done their job and there's a little bit of soil built up, you can get some early grasses, all right? And so what I've got next to me now, well, that's a crack in concrete. That's just a little tiny bit of soil that's built up there. And once those first species colonize that bare rock and start to build up that first tiny layer of organic matter, as they die and they fill in those crevices, that becomes the first soil that first grasses like those next to me, like dandelions. Yeah, dandelions are actually a type of second pioneer species, if you will. All right? They can grow in those small amounts of soil that are available, and then they can begin to produce more soil, and they'll break up that rock even further. The growth of lichens breaks down that rock, which helps form the first soils. Then there's another type of succession. It's called secondary succession. And secondary succession occurs on a surface where an ecosystem has previously existed. It's the process by which one community replaces another community that has been partially or totally destroyed. However, here's the key thing with secondary succession. It's not starting from bare rock. It's starting from bare soil. So the soil's already there, all right? And so the picture I've got over there, that's a picture of plants regrowing after a fire. Secondary succession occurs in ecosystems that have been disturbed by humans, by animals, or by natural processes, such as storms, floods, earthquakes, or, again, forest fire. All right? When that ecosystem has been destroyed and you've removed the dominant plant species there, this succession process starts over, and you go from bare soil back up to a climax community. And then what is a climax community? Well, that's the community at the end. So, what's a climax community? So a climax community is the final stable community in equilibrium with the environment. So right over here, what I've got as a picture of is an oak forest. The oak forest in this state is essentially what it's going to be. And this can actually develop into something even called an old growth forest. It's not just oak forest. There can be a lot of different climax communities. But the idea here is that the mixture of species that you have here, if left undisturbed, it's going to be the same forever. So it may change in small ways, but it's not really going to massively shift. It's not going to, become a grassland or anything like that. It's going to stay what it is. Now, like I said, there's a lot of different things that a climax community can be. So that can be something here in Arizona like, boom, how about a saguaro forest? Yeah, see, those saguaros take a very, very, very long time to grow. They can't land on barren rock and just start growing. What they need is they need the kind of soil that's developed from first having grasses and then some of the shrubs and some of the trees that we get here in the desert. And then eventually you do get the buds of the small, little, tiny little saguaros. After a year, they're only about as big as the thumb, actually. Yeah, they only grow about that big in 1 year. However, you give them about 70 years or so, they'll be grown up to a full height, they'll start putting out arms, and they can live easily 200 years or more. This right here, where you can see a large number of saguaros with multiple arms at multiple stages of their life cycle. You see some small ones over there that haven't put out any arms yet, and you got all the shrubs that are around there, everything like that. That's a climax community. So yeah, when you guys look out in the desert and you see that, expanse of saguaros and stuff like that, that is an excellent example of what the climax community of the desert biome that we live in looks like. And this is essentially where we've gotten to here. So this is a picture actually down near Tucson where, it's a high desert, high temperate desert, and this is the kind of thing that you get. All right, so the next thing I want to mention is something called old field succession. And it is a type of secondary succession. So take a look right next to me again, and you see the big spooky, Hills Have Eyes barn looking thing going on there that looks like something out of a Halloween horror movie kind of deal. All right, well, this is actually going to help me explain old field succession. It's going to sound weird, but let's stick with this for a second. So old field succession is a type of secondary succession that happens when farmland is abandoned. So this thing here looks like a random shack built out in the middle of nowhere. That's actually an old barn that used to be out in the middle of a field. Yeah, this was a field, 150 years ago with a barn in it, and now everything is gone except for this one structure that's managed to survive. So when the farmer stops cultivating the field, grasses and weeds will quickly grow and cover that abandoned field. After the grasses and weeds, then you'll get some shrubs and some bushes, maybe some sapling trees, and eventually you get bigger and bigger trees that'll grow, and by the end, you end up with another climax community. Back to where it was. This is nature reclaiming itself. Over time, taller grasses, perennial grasses, shrubs, and trees will take over this area. And there's a whole chunk of land all up and down the East Coast where you had farms that were started 150 to 200 years ago, around the same time, that the first colonists were clearing land and stuff like that. Those farms failed, or, people moved on or moved to cities, or any number of things could have happened. And these places have been retaken. And this is one such case. So this is in upstate New York, and this is a result of an old farm community that was abandoned because the farm stopped producing, or, industry moved on, or there weren't roads, or whatever happened. And this right here, this barn, is what's left of what was once somebody's farm. And now it's been retaken by the native species of pine trees that you have there. These lodgepole pines have retaken the area. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, but, this is a way that nature is able to reclaim an area. All right, so summing up secondary succession, take a look at this, all right? This is actually a graph that'll show you how this happens. So you'll start off with, first some annual plants, some wildflowers, things like that. After a year or two, you get perennial plants, and those are plants that stick around for multiple years. They'll continue to bloom. After 3 to 10 years, you'll get some reasonable sized shrubs, ferns, things like that. And then over 20 years or so, you get a young pine forest. And then after about 100 to 150 years, you will have a mature forest. Now that can be mature oaks, and oaks are used for a lot of these because a lot of the original studies that were done on succession in places like New England, where oak is the dominant species, or in Germany and Europe, where again, oak is going to be your dominant species. So I'm going to warn you right now, a lot of the stuff that you'll see, they'll say that oak forest is your mature climax community, and it completely ignores other biomes, and I'm sorry for that. But climax communities can happen in a lot of places. Oak is just the one that's used as the example because it's one of the best and one of the oldest that have been studied. Now, that being said, why don't we talk about fire for a second? Because right now, the entire west coast of our country is on fire. All right, we can't really not talk about that. This year, 2020, we had extremely high temperatures. We had a wet winter last winter again, followed by a very long, dry summer. And now that we're in the fall of 2020, we've got massive wildfires. Some of them were started by nature, others were started by people being careless with pyrotechnic devices of all things. All right, so now we've got these raging wildfires like you see here. Well, fire isn't the end of the world. It may look like it, but even fire has a place in secondary succession. So natural fires that are caused by lightning are actually a necessary part of secondary succession in some communities. And in some climax communities, they have to happen regularly. So minor fires will help remove the accumulation of brush and deadwood that would otherwise contribute to major fires that burn out of control. And that's part of what we're seeing right now. This year, part of the reason why we're seeing these out of control fires is that for several years now, there has been a lot of fire suppression, and there's been a buildup of all this kind of dry stuff. So guys, if you look over here, you can see that there are grasses and things like that burning, but if you look at these trees actually stand a good chance of surviving this fire. The fire may burn through and clear out all that underbrush, understory, small shrubs, grasses, that kind of stuff, dead leaf litter, those kind of things will be burned up by this fire. But those trees, a lot of times, their first branches are far enough above the forest floor that they don't catch on fire, that they survive. Or only a small number of branches burn, but the top of the tree has enough moisture in it that it can survive, and the bark of the tree is thick enough. Some species actually need fire. So I'm showing you pictures of pine cones after a fire. What do you see? What you might notice is that all the way over on that side, that pine cone is burned on the outside, but it's opened up completely. Immediately next to me, you can see that there's that red color inside there, even though the outside is burned. And in the middle, you see one pine cone that's all sealed up and one that's wide open. Well, that's because some species of animal depend on occasional fires that feed on the vegetation that sprouts right after the fires cleared the land, because these pine cones do exactly that. Trees produce different types of pine cones, and some of them only open with fire. These types of pine cones, the way that this works is the heat will actually cause that pine cone to open, and down inside those opened areas, that's where the seeds of that pine cone are. And they'll pop out when they get heated up to the right temperature and then dry after the fire. So that pine seed falls in rich soil that's now been packed full of nutrients, and all of that stuff's been recycled by that fire. So that fire is like a way of the forest being reborn. It's a way for the forest to kind of press reset on itself. So even though these fires may look cataclysmic and the end of the world, there's a chance after a fire that you're going to get this secondary succession going, and you can go back to that climax community. Now that can take a long time, and it's really scary to think about that it may take a whole human lifetime to gain that forest back. But this is something that nature has learned how to do, and it's bigger than us in a lot of ways. All right, guys, so let's summarize real quick. All right, when you have a community, all right, something can happen sometimes and wipe the whole slate clean, all right? That could be like a fire or a flood or a hurricane, and that is secondary succession on the bottom, all right? So if you look over there on the bottom, that's secondary succession. What has to happen in secondary succession is you've already got the soil in place, so the first plants are going to be small grasses and flowers and things like that, followed by shrubs, some small trees, and eventually you're going to have a mature forest of some kind, all right? But if you are starting from scratch with blank land with nothing on it, then you're going to have primary succession. And that's going to be up there at the top, all right? That's going to be when you start with bare rock, like you have a lava flow that's just exposed new land, or a glacier's come along and scraped everything away down to just bedrock, all right? Then you have to start with your pioneer species of lichens, which have to start breaking down the rock to provide the first soils so that you can then get your small plants, and then eventually your grasses, and then finally your shrubs and trees, and lastly, big mature trees like oak or whatever, all right? And that is going to be your succession either way. You go from having a empty area of some sort, starting with the first species that are able to exploit that open area, all right? And eventually it grows up to a full, complete ecosystem that's going to have dominant plant species, and then as a result of those dominant plant species, specific animal species that will live there and thrive, all right? When you get to that climax community, that's how things will stay until acted upon by some outside force, either cleared again or, you know, some massive ecological change, all right? But generally speaking, these communities will stay the same way for a long time. And to put this finally in perspective, if we look at the forests of the West Coast that are currently experiencing wildfire, they are old growth forests. They have been forests for 800 years or more, all right? Many of those trees are in that age range of 500 to 800 years in age. There you go. All right, guys, that's all for this video. So there's just some quick reviews on primary and secondary succession. This is the last video for Chapter 5. You guys take care, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.